Every painting he ever made contains the same pair of eyes. Dark, watchful, unblinking. He painted over 2,500 works in the last 15 years of his life. Portraits, landscapes, faces twisted with emotion, bodies hunched against unseen forces. And in every single painting that showed a human face, the same eyes. He never explained why. When people asked about the meaning of his pictures, he simply said, "I remain silent even as my pictures are. It is for them to express and not for me to explain." But we know whose eyes they were, and we know what they meant. Those eyes came to haunt one of the most brilliant minds in human history. His name was Rabindranath Tagore. And if you haven't heard of him, well, that's rather the point of this story. He was the first person outside of Europe to win the Nobel Prize in Literature. He wrote the national anthems of not one, not two, but 3 countries. He debated Albert Einstein about the nature of truth itself, and Einstein, the greatest scientific mind alive, admitted that the poet impressed him. But none of that is the real story. The real story is about a warning that Tagore spent his entire life trying to deliver, and that nobody listened to until it was too late. He warned us that knowledge without wisdom creates monsters, that our modern systems produce followers but not thinkers, workers but not human beings. And tonight, his darkest warning was for us. Welcome, nightlings. This is Huxley. If you like listening or falling asleep to real stories that reveal life's deeper truths, then this is the place for you. Consider subscribing and let the next story find you when you need it most. Let me know in the comments where you are listening from. And what time do you listen to these stories of wisdom? I love seeing where everyone is from. A lot of you comment on my previous story, and I wanted to say, those messages mean more than you know, Faru. Thank you for your comment. The 21 Life Rules episode was one of my favorites, the best human beings in one episode. If you haven't seen it yet, I highly recommend you save it and check it out. Now, as you settle in, find a place to lay or sit without distractions, turn off your notifications, and put your phone out of reach. And let's journey to the past to discover history's wisdom. The room smells of lamp oil and camphor. It is April in Calcutta, the former colonial-era name for Kolkata, the capital of West Bengal in eastern India, and the heat is a living thing. It presses against the walls of the Jorasanko mansion like a heavy hand on your chest. Somewhere in this sprawling, crumbling palace, behind a door that will soon be locked, a young woman lies on a bed, her breath shallow, her pulse fading. Her name is Kadambari Devi. She is 25 years old. She was married into this family at 9. She has no children. Her husband is somewhere else tonight, with someone else. And the one person in this enormous mansion who ever truly saw her, who ever truly loved her, who ever sat with her in the quiet hours and listened to her ideas and laughed at her criticism and grew because of her strength. That person is also somewhere else tonight. He was married off 4 months ago to an 11-year-old girl to break the bond between them. To deal with this, Kadambari chose opium. She swallowed enough to kill 3 people. And now she lies in this room, fighting for her life, and no one will tell the story of what happens next. Not truthfully, not for 100 years. Because even as she gasps for air, even as Dr. D.P. Smith is summoned and paid 400 rupees for his silence, the patriarch of the Tagore family is already giving orders. Destroy her letters, burn her diaries, lose the coroner's report, erase everything. The woman who made Rabindranath Tagore is being unmade by his own family. She will fight for 2 days. She will lose. And the boy she loved, the boy she shaped, the boy whose poetry she pushed and criticized and refined until it shone, he will spend the next 57 years trying to find her. In his words, in his songs, in his paintings. He will write 2,000 songs. He will win a Nobel Prize. He will debate Einstein. He will build a university. He will compose the national anthems of 3 countries. He will throw his knighthood back at the British Empire. But every painting he makes, every single face he draws, will have her eyes. And the question is not whether Rabindranath Tagore became a genius. The question is, can tragedy and trauma create one? Because the man who emerged from that trauma looked at the most powerful civilization on Earth, its schools, its empires, its factories of obedient minds, and delivered the darkest warning in history. You are not educating people. You are creating monsters. And no one listened. If these stories speak to you, if you find comfort in the lessons found in the quiet corners of history, tap the follow button to join our circle of dreamers and let the next story find you when you need it most. Calcutta, 1861. The Jorasanko mansion rose above the Bengali quarter of the city like a small kingdom unto itself. And in many ways, that's exactly what it was. The Tagore family, whose name was originally Thakur, before the British tongue softened it, occupied this vast rambling estate on Dwarkanath Tagore Lane, and within its walls, an entire civilization seemed to pulse and breathe. There were poets in the parlor, philosophers in the library, musicians in the courtyard, playing classical ragas that drifted through the hallways like smoke. Novelists argued at dinner, playwrights staged productions in the family theatre. The eldest brother, Dwijendranath, was a philosopher who could hold forth on the nature of consciousness for hours. Another brother, Satyendranath, had done something no Indian had ever done before. He had cracked the impossibly exclusive Indian civil service examination, that bastion of British superiority, and been appointed to their ranks. A sister, Swarnakumari, wrote novels that were read across Bengal. This was the Bengal Renaissance in miniature. A family that had decided, quite deliberately, that the life of the mind was the only life worth living. And into this extraordinary household, on the 7th of May, 1861, a baby was born who would one day outshine them all. They called him Rabbi. He was the youngest of 13 surviving children. His mother, Sarada Devi, had given birth to 15. The sheer mathematics of that fact tells you something about how much individual attention young Rabbi received, which is to say, almost none. His father, Rabindranath Tagore, was a towering figure in Bengali society, leader of the Brahmo Samaj, a reformist religious movement, a man of deep philosophical conviction who travelled constantly, visiting estates, attending conferences, seeking spiritual truth in the Himalayas, while his youngest son wandered the vast corridors of Jorasanko, with no one particular watching over him. Rabi was raised, in the truest sense of the word, by servants, and the mansion, with all its brilliance and cultural ferment, was, for a small boy without his mother's attention or his father's presence, a rather lonely place. Now, here's the thing about the Jorasanko mansion. It was alive with ideas. The library alone contained books in Bengali, Sanskrit, English, Hindi, Persian. Subjects ranged from philosophy to religion, to science, to history, to literature. A child with curiosity had access to more knowledge than most universities could offer, and Rabi was nothing if not curious. He began writing poetry at the age of 8. Let me say that again, because it deserves a moment. 8 years old. Most children at 8 are concerned with, well, whatever children are concerned with. Rabi was composing verse. By 16, he had published his first substantial collection of poems under the pen name Bhanu Simha, which translates rather grandly as Sun Lion. And here's where the story gets interesting. These poems were so sophisticated, so polished, so seemingly mature in their craft that literary authorities in Bengal seized upon them as long-lost classics. They thought they were reading the work of some ancient, forgotten master. Not a teenager scribbling in the back rooms of the Jorasanko mansion. But the family barely noticed. There were 13 children in that house, each of them talented, each of them demanding, each of them part of the grand cultural project that was the Tagore dynasty. One more poet, even a prodigious one, was hardly remarkable. And so Rabi remained what he had always been, the youngest, the quietest, the one who slipped through the cracks of a house too full of brilliance to notice another spark. He hated school. This is worth mentioning because it becomes important later. From the age of 14, Tagore gradually withdrew from formal education entirely. The British colonial schools of Calcutta were designed with a singular purpose: to produce clerks and administrators for the empire. Memorization, obedience, English as the language of instruction, because the colonizer's tongue was the only one that mattered. The curriculum existed not to enlighten, but to produce. Rabi found this intolerable. Not because he was lazy, though his teachers might have used that word, but because something in him, even at 14, could sense the gap between knowledge and wisdom, between learning facts and understanding life. The schools gave him the former. They had no interest in the latter. But none of that mattered yet. Because what mattered, what changed everything, was not what happened in the classroom. It was what happened in the quiet spaces of the Jorasanko mansion, in the hours between the music and the philosophy, between the poetry readings and the theatrical performances. In those quiet spaces, Rabi found the one person in this enormous, brilliant, overwhelming household who actually saw him. And she was just as lonely as he was. Her name was Kadambari Devi. She had been born Matangini Gangopadhyay on the 5th of July, 1859, which made her just 2 years older than Rabi. She was married into the Tagore family On the 5th of July, 1868, to Gitanjali Tagore, the musician and playwright brother. She was 9 years old on her wedding day. 9. Now, I want to pause here, because this detail tells you everything you need to know about the world Kadambari entered. She was a child, married to a man 10 years her senior, brought into a household of extraordinary intellectual and cultural achievement, where she had no established role, no status, no voice. Gitanjali was consumed by his own artistic pursuits. He was, by most accounts, fond of his young wife in the way one might be fond of a piece of furniture that came with the house. Present, acknowledged, not particularly attended to. Kadambari was lonely to an extreme. And so was Rabi. He was 7 when she arrived. A neglected youngest child with a gift for words and no one to share them with. She was 9. A child bride with an emerging literary sensibility and no one who cared to hear it. They found each other the way lost things do. Not with drama or declaration, but with proximity and recognition. 2 lonely people in a house full of people. They became playmates first, then companions, then something harder to name. As they grew, Kadambari developed into a sharp, bold, intellectually fierce woman. She read voraciously. She argued about literature with a confidence that was unusual for women of her era and class. And she turned that fierce intelligence onto Rabi's writing with the precision of a surgeon. She became his best friend and his harshest critic. And there is a case to be made, a strong one, that without Kadambari Devi, without her relentless standards and her refusal to let him settle for merely good when he was capable of extraordinary, Rabindranath Tagore would never have become the artist the world eventually discovered. She pushed him. She challenged him. She sat with him in the quiet hours, and they talked about the kind of things you talk about when you've found the one person who truly sees you. About ideas, about meaning, about what makes a poem alive versus merely competent. When Rabi was 17, the family sent him to England, ostensibly to study law. In reality, because the Tagore family believed in exposing their children to Western education, even if the children themselves had serious doubts about the enterprise. Rabi went. He enrolled briefly at University College London to study law, quickly lost interest, abandoned the curriculum to read Shakespeare independently, and returned to India in 1880 without a single degree. But here's what matters about the England trip. He and Kadambari wrote to each other. Constantly. Letters that were, by all accounts, brilliantly literary and deeply personal. When Rabi later published some of these letters, the family was scandalized. The elders of the Tagore household read the emotional intensity of those letters and drew their own conclusions. Whether the relationship between Rabi and Kadambari was romantic in the way the family feared, or whether it was something more complex, more intimate, more impossible to categorize. That question has been debated by scholars for over a century. What is not debated is this. The bond between them was the most important relationship in Rabindranath Tagore's young life. She was his mirror, his anchor, his first and most demanding audience. And the family decided it had to end. The solution, as the Tagore elders saw it, was simple. If Rabi's attachment to his sister-in-law was becoming inappropriate, the remedy was obvious. Get him married. Give him a wife of his own. Create distance. And so, on the 9th of December 1883, 22-year-old Rabindranath Tagore was married to 11-year-old Bhavatarini Devi, who would later take the name Mrinalini. The marriage was arranged swiftly. The bride was chosen not for compatibility, but for convenience. This is how these things worked. Kadambari was, by every account, staunchly opposed to the marriage. But what could she do? She was a woman in a patriarchal household, married to a man who was increasingly absent, both physically and emotionally. The rumours about Jyotirindranath were growing louder. There was talk of an affair with a famous actress named Binodini Dasi. Some whispered that Binodini was pregnant with Jyotirindranath's child. Whether this was true or merely the malicious gossip of a crowded household, the effect on Kadambari was the same. Her husband had wandered, and now her closest companion, the boy she had raised and shaped and loved in whatever way she loved him, was being taken from her too. After Rabi's marriage, everything changed. The easy intimacy between them became impossible. A new wife, however young, however disinterested Rabi might have been in the arrangement, created a barrier that hadn't existed before. Kadambari found herself in a position that was, to use a word that doesn't begin to capture the reality, untenable. She had no children. Her husband had allegedly strayed. Her closest companion had been married off. She was 24 years old, and the world had narrowed around her until there was no room left to breathe. On the 19th of April, 1884, 4 months after Rabi's wedding, Kadambari Devi consumed a massive dose of opium. It was enough to kill her several times over. She did not die immediately. She fought for 2 days. In that sweltering Calcutta heat, behind closed doors, attended by a doctor who was paid well for his discretion, Kadambari Devi clung to life with the same fierce determination she had brought to everything else. On the 21st of April, 1884, she died. She was 25 years old, and the Jorasanko mansion, that palace of poets and philosophers and thinkers who had spent their lives in pursuit of truth, fell immediately and completely silent about what had happened. Here is what we know. We know that Rabindranath Tagore, the patriarch, the philosopher, the spiritual leader of the Brahmo Samaj, gave orders. Clear, cold, decisive orders. Destroy everything. Kadambari's letters, burned or hidden. Her diaries, vanished. The coroner's report, suppressed. The doctor's account, purchased for 400 rupees and silence. Every trace of how she died, every hint of why, every document that might have told her story in her own words, gone. The events of those 2 days, the 19th to the 21st of April, 1884, were erased from the family record, as completely as if they had never happened. The Tagore family, those champions of enlightenment, those bearers of the Bengal Renaissance flame, chose to protect their reputation over the truth of a woman's death, and Rabi was left with something perhaps worse than grief. He was left with grief he could not speak about, a loss the family would not acknowledge, a wound with no permission to heal. He dedicated 3 books to Kadambari. He wrote songs about her. He composed poems that scholars believe are addressed to her, though he never confirmed it. He carried her with him in everything he created, but he carried her silently, because the family had decided that silence was the only acceptable response. This is the foundation stone of everything that follows. Every poem, every song, every painting, every lecture about knowledge and wisdom, every school he built, every argument with Gandhi, every word he spoke to Einstein. It all begins here, in a dark room in Calcutta, with a young woman who chose opium over a world that had no room for her, and a young man who would spend the rest of his life trying to prove that world wrong. Now, I need to take you back a bit, because before the tragedy, before the grief, before the ghost settled into its permanent residence in Tagore's soul, there was the education question. And this, Nightlings, is where the warning begins. Rabi hated school. I mentioned this earlier, but I want to be precise about it because this wasn't the ordinary rebellion of a bored child. This was a philosophical rejection. The British colonial education system in India had a very specific purpose. It was designed, quite explicitly, to produce a class of Indians who could serve the empire. Clerks, administrators, petty officials, people who could read English, do sums, follow instructions. The curriculum was standardized, rigid, delivered in a foreign language, and entirely uninterested in the interior life of the student. You memorized, you recited, you passed examinations, you graduated into a life of useful mediocrity. Tagore experienced this system from the inside and recoiled. By 14, he was gradually withdrawing from formal schooling, not because he was stupid, obviously. The boy who wrote publishable poetry at 16 and fooled literary experts into thinking he was an ancient master was not lacking in intelligence. He was lacking in patience for a system that confused knowledge with wisdom. This distinction, by the way, would become the central argument of his entire life. Knowledge, to Tagore, was information. Data. Facts. The ability to recite the periodic table, or conjugate Latin verbs, or calculate the distance between 2 points. Useful, certainly, but not enough. Not nearly enough. Wisdom was something else entirely. Wisdom was understanding why those facts mattered. Wisdom was knowing what to do with knowledge once you had it. Wisdom was the moral framework, the spiritual grounding, the human connection that transformed raw information into something that could actually help people live better lives. And the British education system, in Tagore's view, had all the knowledge in the world and none of the wisdom. It produced brilliant administrators who could run an empire and saw nothing wrong with massacring unarmed civilians. It created institutions of learning that taught everything except how to be human. But all of that was still in the future. In 1878, the Tagore family did what upper-class Bengali families did with promising sons. They sent Rabi to England. He was 17. The plan was for him to study law at University College London, acquire the proper credentials, and return to India suitably polished. It lasted about as long as you'd expect. Rabi enrolled at UCL. He attended a few lectures, and then he quietly abandoned the law curriculum altogether and spent his time reading Shakespeare. Reading, mind you, not studying in any formal, examinable sense. He simply sat in his rooms and read the plays because they interested him, because they taught him things about the human condition that no law lecture ever could. He returned to India in 1880, without a law degree, without any degree at all. That's rather like teaching a nightingale to file tax returns, I've always thought. Some creatures simply aren't built for the cage, no matter how gilded. Now, his father Rabindranath was not pleased. But Rabindranath was a complex man, a spiritual seeker himself, a man who had left the comfortable orthodoxies of Hindu tradition to found a reformist movement, a man who travelled constantly in search of truth. Perhaps he understood at some level that his youngest son's path would not be a conventional one. In any case, Rabi returned to Calcutta. He returned to the Jorasanko mansion. He returned to Kadambari, to the quiet conversations, to the literary partnership that was the most nourishing thing in his life. And then the family decided to end it. What happened next? The marriage? The opium? The silence? I've already told you. But what I haven't told you is what Rabi did with the grief. Because what he did with the grief changed the world. After Kadambari's death, after the cover-up, after the silence settled like dust over the Jorasanko mansion, Tagore threw himself into his work with an intensity that bordered on desperation. He wrote constantly, prolifically, relentlessly. Poetry poured out of him like water from a cracked vessel, and the quality of that poetry was staggering. It was as if the wound had opened something inside him, some deep well of feeling and observation and painful clarity that produced work of extraordinary power. But writing alone wasn't enough, because the grief wasn't just personal, it was philosophical. Kadambari had been destroyed by a system, by a set of social structures that valued propriety over humanity, that placed knowledge of how things should be done above the wisdom of how things should feel. The patriarchal household, the arranged marriage, the erasure of a woman's truth. These were all, in Tagore's evolving understanding, symptoms of the same disease. Knowledge without wisdom. The family knew how to maintain its reputation. It did not know how to save a woman's life. The empire knew how to administer a colony. It did not know how to see its subjects as human beings. The education system knew how to produce clerks. It did not know how to produce citizens. And somewhere in the wreckage of his 23rd year, in the aftermath of the greatest loss of his life, Rabindranath Tagore began to form the philosophy that would define everything he would become. He began to understand that the world didn't need more knowledge. The world was drowning in knowledge. The world needed wisdom, and wisdom, as he would spend the rest of his life arguing, could not be taught in a classroom. It could not be memorized from a textbook. It could not be measured by an examination. Wisdom could only be cultivated slowly, patiently, in a place where the whole person, mind and heart and body and spirit was given room to grow. A place like a garden, or a forest, or a school built under trees. But all of that was still years away. For now, there was grief, and there was writing, and there was the first faint stirring of an idea that would eventually become an institution, a philosophy, and a warning that nobody would listen to until it was too late. The years between 1902 and 1907 are, in the biography of Rabindranath Tagore, a stretch of darkness so dense that it's remarkable anyone emerged from it at all. He was in his early 40s. He had married Mrinalini Devi, the girl chosen for him by his family, and over 19 years of marriage, they had built something real. 5 children, a household, a life. Whatever passion may or may not have existed between them at the beginning, there was, by the time their children were growing, a genuine partnership. Mrinalini managed the household while Tagore managed the family estates in Shilaidaha, a rural area in what is now Bangladesh, where he spent years living among farmers and villagers, observing the rhythms of a life completely different from the Jorasanko mansion. Those years in Shelidaha changed him profoundly. For the first time, Tagore encountered poverty not as an abstraction but as a daily reality. He saw how the colonial system extracted wealth from people who had nothing to begin with. He wrote short stories during this period that are among his finest work, stories about rural Bengali life that treated poor, ordinary people with a dignity and complexity that was radical for the time. But life was about to take everything it had given him. In November of 1902, Mrinalini Devi died. She was 30 years old. 19 years of marriage, 5 children, and then silence. The details of her death are sparse in the historical record, perhaps because Tagore himself rarely spoke of it in specific terms. What we know is this: she fell ill, she declined, and she died. And Tagore was left with 5 children and no partner. Grief, as anyone who has experienced it knows, doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in waves, and just when you think the worst has passed, another wave hits. For Tagore, the waves came in rapid, devastating succession. Less than a year after Mrinalini's death, his second daughter, Renuka, fell ill with tuberculosis. She was 13 years old. In September of 1903, she died. Imagine this: a man in his early 40s, still reeling from the loss of his wife, now standing at the grave of his 13-year-old daughter. The mathematics of grief are not additive. They're exponential. Each loss makes the previous one heavier, as if the weight compounds interest. But there was more. In 1905, Rabindranath Tagore died. Rabi's father, the towering, austere, spiritually seeking patriarch who had travelled the world in search of truth and raised a dynasty of artists and thinkers. The man who had ordered the cover-up of Kadambari's death. The man whose shadow Rabi had spent his entire life trying to step out from under. Gone. And then, in 1907, the cruelest blow of all. Samindranath, Tagore's youngest son, was 13 years old. He was, by all accounts, a bright, lively, beloved child, and he contracted cholera. In the early 20th century, cholera in India was not unusual. It was a disease of poverty, of contaminated water, of the same systemic failures that Tagore had observed in his years among rural farmers. His youngest son died of a disease caused by the very conditions Tagore had spent years writing about. According to Tagore's eldest son, Rabindranath, the death of Samindranath left their father broken-hearted. In 5 years, Tagore had lost his wife, 2 of his 5 children, and his father. He also lost his eldest daughter, Madhurilata, during his lifetime, though the exact year varies in sources. Now, the Knightlings who were here for our evening with Viktor Frankl might remember a similar pattern. A man who lost everything, his family, his freedom, his world, and instead of breaking, found that the loss itself was the teacher. Tagore discovered the same thing, though his classroom looked very different. Because here is what Krishna Kripalani, Tagore's biographer, wrote about this period. It's a sentence I find myself returning to again and again. Death could not break Tagore. It gave him a deeper understanding of life and the meaning of life. I want to sit with that for a moment, because it sounds on the surface like the kind of thing people say to make grief more palatable, a platitude, a silver lining. But in Tagore's case, it was literally true. The grief didn't make him smaller. It made him deeper. The poetry that emerged from this period, from this unimaginable sequence of losses, was qualitatively different from anything he had written before. It was raw, yes, but it was also more universal, more spiritual, more concerned with the fundamental questions of existence, with the nature of death, with the relationship between loss and meaning, with the possibility that grief itself might be a doorway to something larger than the individual self. This is not an argument that suffering is good. I want to be clear about that. Suffering is suffering. What happened to Tagore between 1902 and 1907 was devastating, and no amount of beautiful poetry can make the death of a 13-year-old boy acceptable. But it is an observation about what certain human beings do with their suffering. Some break, some harden, some deepen. Tagore deepened, and from that depth came the work that would change the world. There is a moment in the life of certain artists when everything they have experienced, every joy and every loss, every triumph and every failure, converges into a single body of work that is somehow greater than the sum of its parts. For Tagore, that moment was Gitanjali. The word means song offerings. It's a collection of poems originally written in Bengali and published on the 4th of August 1910. 157 poems, and they are, I think it's fair to say, unlike anything that had been written before. These poems are conversations with the divine, but not in the way of conventional religious poetry. There is no dogma here, no doctrine, no attempt to convince the reader of a specific theological position. Instead, there is yearning, a profound, aching, beautiful yearning for connection with something larger than the self. A yearning born not of faith but of loss, not of certainty but of need. The Gitanjali poems read as if someone who has lost everything is trying to find a way to make that loss meaningful. Not by denying it, not by transcending it, but by sitting inside it and discovering to their surprise that the loss itself opens into something vast and quiet and unexpectedly peaceful. If that sounds to you like the work of a man who watched his wife and children die and chose not to be destroyed by it, that is exactly what it is. In 1912, Tagore decided to translate a selection of these poems into English. He was 51 years old. He was travelling to London with his family, and on the journey, he sat and rendered his Bengali verse into English prose. Not poetry, mind you. Prose. The translations were deliberately simpler, more direct, more accessible than the originals. And here, Nightlings, is where the story takes one of those turns that makes you wonder whether the universe has a sense of humour. Somewhere on the London Underground, during a change of trains, Tagore left the only copy of his English translations behind. The manuscript that contained the work that would eventually win the Nobel Prize sat in a box at a London Underground lost property office, next to someone's umbrella, I'd imagine. It was recovered. Obviously. But the fact that it nearly wasn't, the fact that the most important poems of the 20th century came within a missed announcement of being lost forever, is the kind of detail that reminds you how fragile great art really is. In London, Tagore shared his translations with friends and admirers. The painter William Rothenstein had asked him to translate some of his work, and Rothenstein introduced the translations to William Butler Yeats. Now, Yeats was already one of the most celebrated poets in the English-speaking world. When he read Tagore's translations, he was stunned. He wrote the introduction to what would become the English edition of Gitanjali, published as song offerings by the India Society of London in November 1912. Ezra Pound, another titan of modernist poetry, was equally captivated. The American magazine Poetry published selections from the translations. The literary world took notice. And then, in 1913, on the nomination of British poet Thomas Sturge Moore, Rabindranath Tagore was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature. He was the first Asian to win a Nobel Prize in any category. The first person outside of Europe to win the Nobel Prize in Literature. The first lyricist to win the prize. He was 52 years old. He was a school dropout. He was a man who had lost his wife, his children, his father, his muse. And the work born from that grief, those song offerings composed in the aftermath of unimaginable loss, had just been recognized as among the finest literature in the world. There is a temptation to end this chapter here, on a note of triumph. But I want to resist that temptation, because the Nobel Prize, for all its grandeur, is not actually the point of this story. The point is what the prize represents: the alchemical transformation of grief into gold. The process by which Tagore took the worst thing that had ever happened to him, the worst 5 years of his life, and turned them into something that would resonate across cultures and centuries and languages. That is wisdom, not knowledge. Knowledge tells you what things are. Wisdom tells you what they mean. And Tagore, forged in loss, had more wisdom than most people accumulate in 10 lifetimes. But fame, as you and I both know, is a strange companion. It opens doors and closes others. It brings admirers and parasites in equal measure. It puts a spotlight on everything you do, which is useful if you're doing noble things, and devastating if you're still, deep down, a man trying to paint a dead woman's eyes. The Nobel Prize made Tagore famous. But it didn't make him whole. Nothing could do that. Because the ghost of Kadambari Devi was still there, quiet and patient, waiting in the wings of every poem, every song, every painting that hadn't yet been painted. Shantiniketan. In Bengali, the word means abode of peace. And if you want to understand Rabindranath Tagore, if you want to understand what he was trying to build, what he believed could save the world from the monsters of knowledge without wisdom, this is where you look. The land had originally been purchased by his father, Rabindranath, in 1863. 20 acres of land in Bolpur, a quiet town in Birbhum district, about 150 kilometers north of Calcutta. Rabindranath built a guest house there and named it Shantiniketan, a place of retreat, a place of silence. In 1901, Rabindranath did something with that land that was, in its own quiet way, as radical as any revolution. He started a school. Now, when I say school, I don't mean what you're probably imagining. I don't mean desks in rows and a teacher at a blackboard and children memorizing dates and formulae. Tagore had spent his entire childhood in those schools. He knew what they produced: clerks, functionaries, people who could recite facts but couldn't think for themselves. What he built at Shantiniketan was the opposite. The anti-school, the school for the soul. Classes were held under trees, not as an occasional treat, not as a field trip, but as the primary mode of instruction. Students sat in the open air, surrounded by nature, and learned in an environment where the boundary between the classroom and the world didn't exist. The curriculum was unlike anything the British system offered. Yes, there were sciences and mathematics and languages, but there was also music, dance, painting, theatre, philosophy, agriculture, social welfare. The arts were not supplementary, they were central. Tagore believed, with a conviction born from his own experience, that without music and the fine arts, a nation lacks its highest means of self-expression. He employed what he called the Brahmacharya system, an ancient model where teachers, gurus, gave students personal guidance. Not just intellectual guidance, emotional, spiritual. The teacher was not a dispenser of information, but a mentor of the whole person. And here is the detail that I think captures the depth of his commitment. Tagore taught classes himself, every morning, and in the afternoons and evenings he wrote the textbooks his students would use. He funded the school with his own money. When the Nobel Prize came, in 1913, he invested the prize money directly into Shantiniketan. The dropout invested his Nobel Prize in education. Let me say that again, because the irony is almost too perfect. A man who failed out of school, who dropped out of university, who returned from England without a single degree, took the highest literary honour on earth and used the money to build a school, his school, a school designed to be everything the system that rejected him was not. In 1921, Tagore expanded Shantiniketan into a full university, Visvabharati. The motto he chose was Yatra Vishvam Bhavatyakanidam, which translates as where the whole world meets in one nest. He invited artists and scholars from across India and around the world to live and teach there. He encouraged the revival of folk dances and classical music forms. He brought in painter Nandalal Bose to establish an art program. He insisted that education should be conducted in the mother tongue, because how could you truly reach a person's soul through a foreign language? And the results, Nightlings, speak for themselves. Satyajit Ray, the filmmaker whose work is considered among the finest in cinema history, studied at Shantiniketan. The man who would win an honorary Oscar learned his art under Tagore's trees. Amartya Sen, who would win the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences, was born and raised in Shantiniketan. Years later, he reflected, "It was mainly in Tagore's school that my educational attitudes were formed. This was a co-educational school with many progressive features. The emphasis was on fostering curiosity rather than competitive excellence." Fostering curiosity rather than competitive excellence. I think that single sentence might be the most important thing anyone has ever said about education. Indira Gandhi, who would become India's first female Prime Minister, studied there. Nandalal Bose, whose artwork would define the visual language of modern India, worked there. Ramkinkar Baij, considered one of the greatest Indian sculptors of the 20th century, created there. In 2023, Shantiniketan was inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. the school dropout built a World Heritage Site. I want to pause here, because this is one of those moments in the story where the lesson, the fireside lesson, feels too important to rush past. Tagore didn't just build a school. He proved something. He proved that education without wisdom is training, not learning. He proved that the system that rejected him was, in fact, the broken thing, not him. And he proved that if you have the courage to reject what doesn't serve you and build what does, the results can change nations. So here's what I recommend. If you're lying here tonight feeling like the system, whatever system that is for you, doesn't quite fit. If you've been told that you need certain credentials, certain approvals, certain validations before you can begin the thing you actually care about, consider this. A school dropout who never earned a single degree built a university that produced Nobel laureates, Oscar winners, and prime ministers. He didn't wait for permission. He didn't wait for the system to change. He built something new. Now, I'm not saying you need to build a university, but I am saying this. Identify one subject you're genuinely curious about. Not for work, not for a credential, just because it fascinates you. And spend 15 minutes tomorrow learning about it with no goal other than wonder. No exam, no certificate, no productivity metric. Just curiosity for the sake of curiosity. That is Shantiniketan thinking. And if you do it consistently, if you build a daily habit of learning for the joy of it, 15 minutes a day, I think you'll find that your relationship to knowledge changes. It stops being a burden and starts being a garden. Tagore knew this. He built his entire life around it, and his students changed the world. The year is 1915. Rabindranath Tagore, fresh from his Nobel Prize triumph, receives a new honour. The British Crown, in its infinite generosity, bestows upon him a knighthood. He is now Sir Rabindranath Tagore. This is, on the surface, a remarkable recognition. The highest honour that the British Empire could give to an Indian subject. An acknowledgement that this poet from Calcutta, this school dropout, this man who wrote in Bengali rather than English, had achieved something that even the Empire could not ignore. But knighthoods come with implications. A knight serves, a knight belongs. A knight, however implicitly, accepts the authority of the crown that bestows the title. And for Tagore, who had spent his adult life questioning the very foundations of British authority in India, who had lived among rural farmers and seen what colonial extraction did to human beings, the title sat uneasily. Still, he accepted it. In 1915, the politics of colonial India were complex, and there were pragmatic reasons to maintain a relationship with the crown. Tagore was, above all, a pragmatist. He took the title and wore it lightly. 4 years later, it became unbearable. On the 13th of April 1919, in the city of Amritsar, in the sacred garden of Jallianwala Bagh, a crowd of unarmed Indian civilians had gathered. They were there for a peaceful protest meeting. Men, women, children, families. Ordinary people exercising what they believed to be their right to assemble. General Reginald E.H. Dyer had a different view. Without warning, without giving the crowd a chance to disperse, Dyer ordered his troops to open fire. The soldiers fired for approximately 10 minutes. They fired until their ammunition was nearly exhausted. The garden was enclosed on 3 sides by walls and buildings, with a narrow exit through which people could not escape quickly enough. The crowd was trapped. The official British count put the death toll at 379, with approximately 1,200 wounded. Indian estimates were significantly higher. People were shot in the back as they tried to flee. Some threw themselves into a well to escape the bullets. Bodies lay in the garden, uncollected, as Dyer imposed martial law and a curfew that prevented families from retrieving their dead. Tagore heard the news on the 22nd of May, 1919. It took that long for the full scope of the massacre to reach him. When it did, he tried to organize a protest meeting in Calcutta. The meeting was blocked or proved impossible to arrange effectively. And so Tagore chose a different form of protest, a symbolic one. On the 30th of May, 1919, he wrote a letter to Lord Chelmsford, the Viceroy of India. In that letter, he renounced his knighthood. The letter was published in The Statesman on the 3rd of June, 1919, and later in the Modern Review. In it, Tagore wrote of the helplessness of our position as British subjects in India. He expressed his wish to stand, shorn of all special distinctions, by the side of those of my countrymen. Shorn of all special distinctions. Think about that phrase. He wasn't just returning a title. He was stripping himself bare, removing the armor of imperial approval, and choosing to stand alongside the ordinary people who had been gunned down in a garden. This was, in the most literal sense, knowledge without wisdom creating monsters. The British Empire was the most knowledgeable institution on earth. It had mapped the globe. It had conquered continents. Its universities produced scientists, engineers, administrators of extraordinary competence. And all of that knowledge, all of that capability, all of that institutional brilliance could not prevent a general from ordering his soldiers to shoot unarmed women and children in an enclosed garden. Tagore saw this with absolute clarity. The empire had all the knowledge in the world. It had none of the wisdom. And so he gave back the only thing he could: his title, his belonging, his complicity. It was not a grand gesture in the way that later political acts would be. Gandhi's Salt March, for example, was a spectacle designed for maximum public impact. Tagore's renunciation was quieter, more personal, a man alone, writing a letter in a room. But it mattered, because Tagore was not merely a poet. He was the most internationally celebrated Indian alive. His renunciation brought attention to the Jallianwala Bagh massacre in circles that might otherwise have remained ignorant. It embarrassed the Crown. It signaled to India and to the world that there was a moral line, and that the empire had crossed it. And it cost him something. The knighthood, whatever its political complications, was real. It opened doors. It conferred status. Giving it back meant accepting a diminishment in the eyes of those who measured value by imperial recognition. Tagore accepted that diminishment, because he understood something that the empire, with all its knowledge, could not grasp, that moral authority matters more than institutional authority, that standing with the powerless is more honorable than sitting with the powerful. That wisdom, true wisdom, sometimes means giving back the things the world tells you to keep. After the knighthood renunciation, Tagore embarked on what might be called his prophetic phase. Between 1916 and 1932, He traveled to more than 30 countries on 5 continents, delivering a message that almost nobody wanted to hear. The message was simple: militant nationalism will destroy you. He said this in Japan in 1916, where the rising tide of imperial ambition was already visible. He said it in the United States, where nationalism wore the mask of American exceptionalism. He said it in Europe, where the scars of the First World War were still fresh, but the seeds of the Second were already being planted. His lectures were received politely. In Europe, people found them eloquent and thoughtful. In Japan, they were criticized. In the United States, they were largely ignored. Critics called his ideas poetic but defeatist, which is, I think, the most revealing criticism possible. It tells you everything about what the world valued: effectiveness over truth, power over wisdom, action over understanding. Tagore was not a pacifist in the simple sense. He did not argue that force was never justified. He argued something more subtle and more dangerous, that the kind of nationalism that subordinates human beings to the machinery of the state, that values national identity over universal humanity, that measures greatness in territory conquered rather than wisdom cultivated. That kind of nationalism was a form of madness, a kind of collective insanity that would, if unchecked, lead to catastrophe. He was right about everything. The First World War had already proved his point. The Treaty of Versailles, with its punitive terms and its nationalistic resentments, was proving it again. And while Tagore was travelling the world, warning anyone who would listen, a failed painter in Munich was writing a book about national destiny and racial purity that would eventually engulf the world in flames. But prophets are not popular. Prophets tell you things you don't want to hear. And the world in the 1920s and 1930s wanted to hear about progress, about power, about the march of technology and industry and national greatness. It did not want to hear from a Bengali poet that all of that progress meant nothing without wisdom, that the very knowledge driving the modern world, the science, the engineering, the institutional competence, was dangerous precisely because it was unmoored from moral understanding. During these travels, Tagore met some of the most remarkable minds of the century. Henri Bergson, the French philosopher; Robert Frost, the American poet; Thomas Mann, the German novelist; George Bernard Shaw, the Irish playwright; H.G. Wells, the science fiction visionary; Romain Rolland, the French humanist who shared Tagore's concern about nationalism's destructive potential. In 1926, Tagore was invited to Italy by Benito Mussolini. He went. He was initially impressed by the hospitality, by the apparent energy and purpose of the fascist state. But as he observed more closely, his admiration curdled into criticism. He saw, beneath the efficiency and the spectacle, the same disease he had identified everywhere: knowledge without wisdom, power without compassion, order without humanity. And then came Argentina. In 1924, Tagore, 63 years old and not in the best health, travelled to South America. He fell ill. An Argentinian writer named Victoria Ocampo took him in, nursed him back to health, and in a detail that will become important later, encouraged him to take up something he had never seriously attempted before: painting. But that it comes later. For now, the prophet continued his rounds, warning, lecturing, writing, and being, for the most part, politely ignored, because the world doesn't listen to wisdom until after the catastrophe. It listens to knowledge. It listens to power. It listens to confidence and certainty and promises of greatness. Wisdom sounds too much like hesitation, too much like doubt, too much like, perhaps we should think about this before we act. And the world, in the 1920s and 1930s, was done thinking. It was ready to act, and the consequences of that action would prove Tagore right in the most devastating way imaginable. But before that reckoning, there was one more conversation to have. One more intellectual confrontation that would crystallize everything Tagore believed about the relationship between knowledge and wisdom, between science and spirit, between the measurable and the meaningful. It happened in Berlin, in a small study, between two men who had each, in their own way, changed the world. And one of them was about to make Einstein question everything. Before we enter Einstein's study, I need to tell you about a different kind of intellectual confrontation. One that lasted not an afternoon, but 26 years. One that involved not physics and metaphysics, but politics, strategy, and the soul of a nation. It's the story of Tagore and Gandhi, and it begins with a gift. In the early years of the 20th century, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi returned to India from South Africa, where he had developed his philosophy of non-violent resistance. He was not yet the Gandhi the world would come to know. He was a lawyer, an activist, a man with strong convictions and a growing following, but not yet a legend. He visited Shantiniketan on the 6th of March, 1915. Tagore met him. And something in that meeting moved Tagore deeply, because it was Tagore who gave Gandhi the title that would define him forever, Mahatma, Great Soul. Think about the weight of that. Tagore, already a Nobel laureate, already the most celebrated Indian alive, looked at this lawyer from South Africa and saw something that transcended politics. He saw a great soul, and he said so, publicly. That title stuck. It became Gandhi's identity, Mahatma Gandhi. The name that would be synonymous with nonviolent resistance, with Indian independence, with moral courage in the face of imperial power. But here is the part of the story that most people don't know. Tagore spent the next 26 years publicly disagreeing with the man he'd just called a great soul. Their first major disagreement came in 1921, over Gandhi's non-cooperation movement. Gandhi was calling on Indians to refuse to cooperate with British institutions, to boycott schools, courts, legislatures. It was a powerful, dramatic gesture. It captured the imagination of millions. Tagore was horrified, not by the goal. He wanted Indian independence as much as anyone, but by the method. Tagore believed that giving millions of people the unrestricted right to non-cooperation without careful education about what that meant in practice was dangerous. He called the idea negative in nature and warned that violence was inherent in it. He was proved right when the Chauri Chaura incident occurred. On the 4th of February 1922, a large group of protesters in the town of Chauri Chaura turned violent, attacking a police station and killing 22 policemen. The incident was so alarming that Gandhi himself called off the entire non-cooperation movement. Tagore had predicted exactly this, but being right did not make him popular. Their second disagreement was about the burning of foreign clothes. Gandhi's Swadeshi movement encouraged Indians to burn their British-made garments as a symbolic act of defiance. Tagore thought this was wasteful and misguided. Burning clothes wasn't revolution. It was theatre. Gandhi countered that by burning foreign clothes, a person was burning their shame, obliterating the symbol of foreign domination. The argument reveals the fundamental difference between the two men. Gandhi was a man of symbols and gestures, of moral spectacle designed to inspire the masses. Tagore was a man of ideas and systems, of structural change designed to transform how people think. Both were right, both were incomplete without the other. But it was their third disagreement that cut deepest. Gandhi believed in the charkha, the spinning wheel. He wanted Indians to spin their own cloth as a daily practice, a form of economic self-sufficiency and spiritual discipline. The charkha became the most powerful symbol of the independence movement. It appears, to this day, on the Indian flag. Tagore was scathing. In September of 1925, he published an essay called The Cult of the Charkha, in which he argued that Gandhi's obsession with the spinning wheel would lead India back into the medieval age. He said it inculcated disregard for science. He argued that India needed scientific temperament and innovation, the spirit of inquiry and progress, not a return to pre-industrial manual labor. This was, you'll notice, the knowledge versus wisdom argument in another form. But this time, Tagore was on the side of knowledge. He believed that India needed modern science, modern industry, modern institutions. What it didn't need was the kind of knowledge that came divorced from human values. And he feared that Gandhi's romantic attachment to the spinning wheel would deprive India of the scientific progress it desperately needed. Though I suppose every family has its disagreements, ours tend to be about the thermostat. What's remarkable about the Tagore-Gandhi relationship is not the disagreements, it's the fact that they disagreed so profoundly, so publicly, so persistently, and remained friends for 26 years. From their first meeting in 1915 until Tagore's death in 1941, the two men argued, criticized, challenged, and frustrated each other. And they never stopped respecting each other. In 1932, Tagore even helped mediate between Gandhi and B.R. Ambedkar, the leader of India's Dalits, over the question of separate electorates for untouchable castes. Gandhi had announced a fast unto death in protest. The situation was critical, and it was Tagore who helped broker a resolution. There is a lesson here that I think we've lost in the modern world. Tagore and Gandhi showed us that you can deeply love someone and still believe they're wrong about something important. That disagreement, when rooted in genuine respect and shared purpose, is not a betrayal but a form of love. Perhaps the hardest form. We've become so tribal in our loyalties, so quick to cast out anyone who disagrees, that we've forgotten what it looks like when two great minds sharpen each other through friction. Tagore made Gandhi think more carefully. Gandhi made Tagore think more practically. Neither would have been as great without the other's opposition. July the 14th, 1930. Berlin, the outskirts of the city, a modest study in a modest house. Albert Einstein, wild-haired and 51 years old, was already the most famous scientist in the world. His theories of relativity had rewritten the laws of the universe. His name was synonymous with genius itself. He was, in every measurable sense, the supreme representative of knowledge, of the scientific method, of the power of the rational mind to penetrate the deepest mysteries of existence. And into his study walked a man who would challenge everything he believed. Rabindranath Tagore was 69, tall, bearded, dressed in flowing Indian robes. He looked like what he was: a poet, a philosopher, a sage from another tradition, another way of seeing the world. Where Einstein represented the pinnacle of Western scientific thought, Tagore represented something older, more fluid, more comfortable with ambiguity. They sat down, and they proceeded to have one of the most extraordinary conversations in the history of human thought. The question they were wrestling with sounds simple. It isn't. Is truth independent of human consciousness? Einstein believed firmly that it was. He argued that the Pythagorean theorem, for instance, states something that is approximately true whether or not human beings exist to know it. The laws of physics, the mathematical relationships that govern the universe, these things are real regardless of whether anyone is observing them. Truth exists. We discover it. We don't create it. Tagore disagreed, profoundly. The world apart from us does not exist, Tagore said. It is a relative world, depending for its reality upon our consciousness. Now, this might sound like mysticism, and in a sense it is. But it's also, and this is the part that rattled Einstein, remarkably close to what quantum physics was beginning to suggest. The observer affects the observed. Consciousness plays a role in shaping reality. The universe is not a machine running independently of the minds that perceive it. Einstein pushed back. He offered the example of a table. If nobody is in this house, he said, yet that table remains where it is. Tagore's response was precise. Yes, it remains outside the individual mind, but not the universal mind. The table which I perceive is perceptible by the same kind of consciousness which I possess. In other words, the table exists because consciousness exists, not because your specific consciousness perceives it, but because consciousness as a universal phenomenon includes it. Without consciousness, without minds, without beings capable of perceiving, the table is nothing. Not because it vanishes, but because the very concept of existence requires someone to exist for. Einstein struggled with this. You can feel it in the transcript of their conversation. He wanted to believe in an independent, objective reality. He needed to believe in it. The entire edifice of physics depends on the assumption that the universe operates according to laws that exist whether or not humans are around to discover them. But Tagore was challenging that assumption at its root. And Einstein, to his enormous credit, didn't dismiss the challenge. He engaged with it. He wrestled with it. He admitted that he couldn't prove his position. I cannot prove scientifically that truth must be conceived as a truth that is valid independent of humanity, Einstein said. But I believe it firmly. And then came the moment that has echoed through intellectual history ever since. Einstein, the scientist, the rationalist, the man who had spent his life discovering objective truths about the universe, looked at Tagore, the poet, the mystic, the man who believed that truth was inseparable from consciousness. And he said, "Then I am more religious than you are." The room must have been silent for a moment. Because what Einstein had just admitted was extraordinary. He, the great scientist, believed in something he couldn't prove. He had faith in an objective universe. And the spiritual philosopher, sitting across from him, was the more rigorous thinker. the one who refused to believe in anything that couldn't be grounded in human experience. The scientist was the believer. The mystic was the skeptic. They met at least 4 times between 1926 and 1931 in Berlin and New York City. The New York Times ran a headline, "Einstein and Tagore plumb the truth." And plumb it they did. They drilled down to the bedrock of what it means to know something, to believe something, to claim that something is true, and neither of them won. I want to sit with that for a moment, because it's so rare and so valuable in a world that demands winners and losers, that insists on definitive answers and settled debates. 2 of the greatest minds in human history sat across from each other and failed to resolve the question. And that failure was the most profound thing about their exchange. Because wisdom, as Tagore spent his life arguing, is not about having the answer. It's about having the patience to sit with the question. Here's what I recommend, Nightlings. The next time someone asks your opinion on something genuinely complex, something where the answer isn't clear and the evidence points in multiple directions, try saying, "I'm still thinking about that." Not as evasion, not as weakness, but as honesty. Watch how it changes the conversation. Watch how the other person responds when you refuse to perform certainty you don't feel. Tagore and Einstein didn't have the answer. They had something better. They had the humility to admit it. And their conversation 96 years later still resonates. Because the questions they asked, the questions about whether reality depends on consciousness, about whether truth exists independent of the minds that perceive it, we still haven't answered them. And perhaps the fact that we can't is itself a kind of answer. And now we come to the paintings. Do you remember Victoria Ocampo, the Argentinian writer who nursed Tagore back to health during his 1924 visit to South America? She did something for him that no one else had done. She looked at the doodles and erasures in the margins of his manuscripts and said, "These are art." Tagore had been marking up his own poems for years. When he made mistakes, when he crossed out a line or scratched through a word, the erasures themselves took on shapes. Faces, animals, abstract patterns. They were calligraphic accidents that began to look intentional. And Ocampo, with the eye of a writer who understood that creativity doesn't always announce itself, saw what others had missed. She encouraged him to paint. He was 63 years old. Now, there are many things you might start at 63. A garden, perhaps, a memoir, a new recipe for soup. But Tagore didn't start a garden. He started a revolution in Indian art. With no formal training, no technique beyond what his hands discovered on their own, no tradition to belong to, and no tradition to rebel against. He simply began, and once he began, he couldn't stop. Over the next 15 years, from 1924 until his death in 1941, Tagore created more than 2,500 artworks. Paintings, drawings, ink washes, watercolors. He worked with whatever was at hand, whatever his color-blind eyes could perceive. Yes, color-blind. He was likely red-green color-blind, which explains the strange, offbeat, eerily distinctive color schemes that make his work instantly recognizable. His style belonged to nothing and nobody. Art historians have noted similarities to German Expressionism, but Tagore hadn't studied Expressionism. He was influenced, if anything, by the scrimshaw carvings of the Malangan people of Papua New Guinea and the Haida carvings of the Pacific Northwest. things he had encountered in museums during his travels. But in truth, his art was as original as his poetry. He invented his own visual language the same way he had invented his own poetic voice, by ignoring what already existed and creating what needed to exist. He called it Shesh Boisha Priya, an affair in the evening of life. And now I need to tell you the part of this story that brings everything full circle. The part that connects the paintings to the mansion, the death to the art, the ghost to the genius. Tagore could not draw anyone else's eyes. In every painting that showed a human face, every portrait, every sketch, every ink-wash study of human features, the eyes were the same. Dark, watchful, hooded, sad. They were Kadambari's eyes, 40 years after her death. 40 years after the opium, the 2 days of fighting, the cover-up, the silence. 40 years after the woman who made him was unmade by his own family. She was still there, in every face he drew, in every eye that stared back at him from the canvas. The darkness and gloom that pervade his paintings of humans, the elongated faces, the shadowed features, the overwhelming sense of grief and loneliness that art critics have noted in his work. These are not stylistic choices. They are a haunting, a literal lifelong haunting by a woman who died at 25 and never stopped looking at the man she loved. When people asked Tagore about the meaning of his pictures, he refused to explain. People often ask me about the meaning of my pictures, he said. I remain silent even as my pictures are. It is for them to express and not for me to explain. But we know, don't we? We know whose eyes those are. We know what they're saying. We know why a man of 80, in the last year of his life, was still painting the same pair of eyes he'd been carrying since he was 23. Some ghosts don't leave because you don't want them to. I want to change the pace here, because amid the grief and the philosophy and the paintings, there is something about Tagore's life that is simply, almost comically, extraordinary in its scope. And I think it deserves its own moment. Rabindranath Tagore wrote the national anthem of India, Jana Gana Mana. You've heard it, even if you don't know the name. It was adopted as India's national anthem on the 24th of January, 1950. A song that defines the identity of over 1 billion people was composed by a man who hated nationalism. But he also wrote the national anthem of Bangladesh, Amar Sona Bangla, My Golden Bengal. A love song to the Bengali landscape and people, adopted as the anthem of a nation that didn't exist when Tagore wrote it. Bangladesh wouldn't become an independent country until 1971, 30 years after Tagore's death. But when it did, the song was waiting. And there is credible evidence, though scholars debate the exact degree of his involvement, that Tagore inspired the national anthem of Sri Lanka as well. 3 countries, 3 national anthems, 1 man. No other human being in recorded history has achieved this. And the paradox is almost too rich to bear. The man who spent his life warning against nationalism, who called the nation a machine, who argued that internationalism and universal humanity should transcend the narrow loyalties of national identity. This man wrote the songs that define multiple nations. How do you reconcile that? I'm not sure you can. And perhaps that's the point. Perhaps the fact that Tagore could love specific places, specific peoples, specific landscapes, while simultaneously warning against the political structures that claimed to represent them. Perhaps that contradiction is itself a form of wisdom. The ability to hold two apparently incompatible truths at the same time without needing to resolve them. He also composed over 2,000 songs beyond the national anthems. They form a genre called Rabindra Sangeet, Tagore songs, and they are the cultural bedrock of Bengali life. They are sung at weddings and funerals, at festivals and quiet evenings, in homes and concert halls across Bengal and Bangladesh. They are, in a very real sense, the musical language of an entire civilization. Most people can't write one song that endures. This man wrote 2,000, and 3 of them define nations. I'm running out of superlatives here. And I suspect Tagore himself would have found the exercise rather tedious. He was, after all, a man who valued the unfinished, the unexplained, the humble. He would probably have pointed out that the songs weren't his best work and changed the subject to something more interesting. But I'm not Tagore. And I think the sheer scale of what one human being accomplished deserves a moment of quiet awe before we move on. Because what comes next is not awe, it's anger and injustice, and a theft that serves as the perfect metaphor for a world that treasures genius in theory and destroys it in practice. On the 25th of March, 2004, 63 years after Rabindranath Tagore's death, someone broke into the Rabindra Bhavan Museum at Visva Bharati University, the university Tagore had built with his Nobel Prize money. The institution that embodied his philosophy of wisdom over mere knowledge. The place where Satyajit Ray learned to see and Amartya Sen learned to think. They went to the glass display case that held Tagore's most famous possession, his Nobel Prize medal. It was 18-karat gold, weighing 206 grams. It had been sitting in that case for decades, surrounded by other treasures. Tagore's father's gold ring, Tagore's own favourite gold pocket watch, and approximately 50 other personal belongings that traced the arc of one of history's most remarkable lives. The thieves took everything: the medal, the ring, the watch, the personal effects, everything that could be pried from its display or carried in a bag. They vanished into the night, leaving behind only broken glass and an alarm system that had apparently failed. The news broke across India like a thunderclap. The CBI, India's Central Bureau of Investigation, was brought in. Search operations fanned out across West Bengal and beyond. Tips were followed. Suspects were interrogated. In 2016, a ball singer named Kadambari was arrested on suspicion of sheltering the thieves. The investigation continued, but the medal was never found. On the 7th of December 2004, the Swedish Academy announced that it would present 2 replicas of Tagore's Nobel Prize to Visva Bharati University. One made of gold, one of bronze. Replicas, not the original, because the original, the actual physical object that represented the world's recognition of the greatest body of grief-born poetry ever written, was gone, probably melted down, probably sold for its weight in gold. 206 grams. At current prices, maybe $12,000 or $13,000. That's what the world's recognition of Gitanjali was worth to whoever took it. $12,000. As of 2022, West Bengal Chief Minister Mamata Banerjee publicly lamented that the medal had still not been recovered, calling the CBI's failure to crack the case a big insult for the people of Bengal. I tell you this not because the medal matters in itself. Tagore would have been the first to tell you that a piece of metal, however prestigious, is just a piece of metal. The poetry exists whether or not there's a medallion to commemorate it. The Gitanjali poems are not diminished by the theft of an award. But the symbolism is almost too pointed to bear. Tagore built Visva Bharati as a temple of wisdom, a place where knowledge was married to moral understanding, where education meant cultivating the whole person, where the life of the mind was inseparable from the life of the spirit. And someone walked into that temple and stole the one object that the world had given to honor its founder's genius. Knowledge without wisdom. A thief who knew the medal was valuable, but didn't understand what it represented. A society that claimed to treasure Tagore, but couldn't protect his legacy from a burglar with a glass cutter. It's the smallest, most petty version of the warning Tagore spent his life delivering. And somehow, because of its smallness, its pettiness, it stings more than the grand catastrophes. The Jallianwala Bagh massacre was monstrous. The world wars were cataclysmic. But a stolen Nobel Prize from a university built with the prize money. That's the kind of failure that would have made Tagore sigh, sit down in his reading chair, and say nothing at all. Because what is there to say? The last years of Rabindranath Tagore's life were a study in contradiction. His body was failing. His mind was on fire. In late 1937, he collapsed and fell into a coma. For days, those around him believed he would die. The great poet, the great philosopher, the great painter, the great educator, the great traveller, the great debater, the man who had warned the world about the monsters of knowledge without wisdom, was lying in a bed, unconscious, while the world outside was proving him right in the most devastating way possible. He recovered. Not fully, but enough. Enough to watch, enough to see. And what he saw in those last 4 years must have been agonizing. The Second World War began in 1939. The very catastrophe he had been warning about since 1916. The very collision of militant nationalism and knowledge without moral grounding that he had predicted in lecture halls from Tokyo to New York was unfolding across the globe. Germany, that nation of extraordinary scientific achievement, of universities that had produced some of the greatest minds in human history, of a culture that had given the world Beethoven and Goethe and Kant, had turned its knowledge into weapons of genocide. The concentration camps, the Blitzkrieg, the systematic, industrialized, scientifically managed extermination of millions of human beings. This was the ultimate monster. The monster Tagore had seen coming. Knowledge without wisdom, taken to its logical extreme. And Japan. Tagore had visited Japan 3 times. He had respected its culture, admired its modernization, warned against its militant tendencies. In December 1937, when Japanese forces attacked Nanking and committed atrocities that shocked the world, Tagore had condemned the massacre in unequivocal terms. He had written to his old friend Noguchi, the Japanese poet, expecting him to share the condemnation. Noguchi had instead tried to justify the massacre on patriotic grounds. The friendship ended, the last thread connecting Tagore to his old hope that Japan might choose wisdom over power, snapped. But even in these final years, even as his body weakened and the world burned, Tagore continued to create. His late poetry is considered by many scholars to be among his finest work. There is a quality to it, a depth and a clarity that comes from the knowledge that time is running out. These poems are preoccupied with death, yes, but not in a morbid way, more in the way of someone who is looking at death the way you look at an old acquaintance you haven't seen in a while, with recognition, with acceptance, with a kind of tired warmth. He was also writing about science. In 1937 he published Visva Parichay, a collection of essays exploring biology, physics, and astronomy. Even at 76, comatose 1 month, and writing about particle physics the next, Tagore refused to let the boundary between the sciences and the humanities remain intact. He had spent his life arguing that these things belonged together, that knowledge and wisdom were not separate disciplines but two aspects of the same human need to understand. He continued painting. The faces, the eyes, the haunting, elongated figures with their hooded gazes and their darkness. Kadambari was still there. She had been there since 1884. She would be there until the end. I want to pause here, because this chapter, more than any other, is where the warning becomes personal. Tagore saw it all. He saw what happens when knowledge outpaces wisdom. He saw it in the British Empire, which knew how to run a colony, but not how to see its subjects as human beings. He saw it in the nationalist movements that swept across Europe and Asia, which knew how to mobilize populations, but not how to value individual lives. He saw it in the education systems that produced brilliant technicians and moral illiterates. And he is seeing it now, in us. I don't say that lightly. I don't say it to be dramatic or to score points against the modern world. I say it because I think it's true. We live in an age of more information than any previous generation could have imagined. We carry in our pockets devices that give us access to the sum of human knowledge. We can learn anything, read anything, know anything, at any time, for free. And we are, by many measures, less wise than we have ever been. We doom scroll through an infinite feed of content that informs us about everything and teaches us about nothing. We consume knowledge the way we consume fast food, quickly, constantly, and without nourishment. We know more about the surface of Mars than we do about the inner lives of our neighbors. We have artificial intelligence that can write poetry, but can't tell you why poetry matters. This is the world Tagore warned us about, not because he could see the future, but because he could see the pattern. The pattern has always been the same. Knowledge advances, wisdom falls behind, and in the gap between them, monsters grow. Here's what I recommend. Nightlings. And this one is important, so I'm going to take my time with it. Before you fall asleep tonight, ask yourself one question. Just one. Not a question about your schedule tomorrow, or your inbox, or your to-do list. A question about your life. What have I learned recently that actually changed how I see the world? Not what have I read, not what have I scrolled past, not what have I consumed. What have I actually learned? What piece of knowledge has transformed into wisdom? What fact has become understanding? If you can't answer that question, that's not a failure. That's a signal that you might be living in exactly the gap that Tagore warned about, the gap between knowing and understanding, between information and wisdom. And closing that gap doesn't require a university. It doesn't require a degree. It doesn't even require a book. It requires attention. The kind of attention Tagore described when he said that education should not merely give us information, but should make our lives in harmony with all existence. Harmony with all existence. That's a phrase you could spend a lifetime unpacking, and it's worth every moment. Tomorrow, read one thing slowly, deeply, with your full attention. Not to consume it, not to have read it, to understand it. That's the beginning. That's how you build your own Shantiniketan. One moment of genuine understanding at a time. July the 25th, 1941. They bring him home. The Jorasanko mansion. The same sprawling, crumbling palace where he was born 80 years ago. The same corridors he wandered as a lonely child, looking for someone who would see him. The same rooms where Kadambari Devi once sat, and pushed him to write better, to think harder, to become the artist she knew he could be. He is dying. Everyone knows it. The kidney and prostate problems have become unmanageable. He is in pain. He has fevers, headaches, chest pains. He has lost his appetite. The man who once travelled to 30 countries, who debated Einstein, who composed 2,000 songs, who painted 2,500 pictures, who built a university from nothing, can barely sit up in bed. On the 30th of July, an operation is scheduled. The doctors believe it might extend his life by several years. But they have made a decision. They will not tell him about the surgery. They fear that if Tagore knows, he will refuse it. He has always been the kind of man who makes his own decisions about his own life, and the doctors suspect that his decision at 80 would be to decline. So they don't tell him. But on that same day, the 30th of July, Tagore calls for his secretary, Ekasen, and he dictates a poem, his last poem. I am not going to try to reproduce it here, because it belongs to him and to Bengali literature, and not to me. But I want you to know that it exists. That, on the day before a surgery he didn't know was coming, Rabindranath Tagore's final act of creation was a poem, not a letter, not instructions for his estate, not a will, a poem. After a lifetime of loss, after Kadambari and Mrinalini and Renuka and Samindranath and his father and his friends and his hopes for a world that would listen to his warnings, his last words were verse. That tells you everything, doesn't it? The operation takes place. It does not save him. On the morning of August the 7th, 1941, they remove the oxygen tubes. At 12 minutes past noon, in an upstairs room of the Jorasanko mansion in Calcutta, Rabindranath Tagore dies. He was born in this house. He wrote his first poem in this house. He lost Kadambari in this house. He received the news of his Nobel Prize in this house. And now, 80 years after he entered the world, as the 15th child of an overwhelmed mother and a travelling father, he leaves it in the same place. The full circle, the beginning and the end, the same walls, the same light through the same windows, the same mansion that had been both his prison and his cradle, his wound and his sanctuary. The news spread through Calcutta like wildfire. Within hours, thousands of people flooded the streets around the Jorasanko mansion. They came from across the city, from across Bengal, from across India. Workers and professors, children and grandparents, Muslims and Hindus, rich and poor. They came to see the man who had given them their words. Because that is what Tagore had done ultimately. He had given people their words, their songs, their anthems, their philosophy, their way of seeing the world. He had taken the grief that should have destroyed him and transformed it into a language that an entire civilization could speak. Tagore had wished for a silent, dignified death. He wanted to be laid to rest under the open sky amid the freedom and silence of nature. Like Shantiniketan, like the abode of peace he had spent his life building, he didn't get his wish. The funeral was a sea of humanity. The streets were impassable. The crowd was too large, too emotional, too grateful to allow for silence. But perhaps, in a way, the crowd was his answer. The crowd was the proof that his life had mattered. That the warnings, the songs, the schools, the paintings, the poems, the debates, the lectures, the sacrifices, all of it had reached someone. Many someones, millions of someones. The prophet had been heard after all. Not by the politicians and generals who could have prevented the catastrophes, but by the ordinary people who needed his words to make sense of a world that seemed determined to lose its way. And now the story is Tagore's, but the warning is ours, because everything he predicted came true, every single thing. He warned that the British Empire's knowledge, untempered by wisdom, would create monsters. The Jallianwala Bagh massacre was the proof. The partition of India, which came 6 years after his death, was the exclamation mark. He warned that militant nationalism would destroy the world. 2 world wars proved him right. The death toll, by the time the Second War ended, was somewhere between 70 and 85 million human beings. The most knowledgeable civilizations on Earth. The nations with the best universities and the most advanced science had produced the Holocaust, the atomic bomb, and the systematic destruction of entire peoples. He warned that education systems focused on knowledge without wisdom would produce technicians but not thinkers. And here we are, in an age where we can fact-check anything in seconds but can't agree on what truth means. Where we have more graduates than ever and less common sense than our grandparents. Where we have optimized for the measurable and lost track of the meaningful. He warned about all of it. In lecture halls, in poems, in essays, in letters, in conversations with Einstein, and arguments with Gandhi and classes under trees. Nobody listened. Not in time. And so, nightlings, I find myself wondering, if Tagore could see us tonight, all of us, bathed in the blue light of our screens, consuming more information in a single day than he encountered in a year, I wonder whether he would see the monsters he warned us about, or whether he would see something else entirely. I've thought about that, and I'm still not sure. Some would say Tagore was naive, a poet who mistook beauty for politics. Others would say he saw more clearly than any politician of his century. I suppose it depends on whether you believe wisdom is a luxury or a necessity. But here is what I know. I know that the man who warned the world about the dangers of knowledge without wisdom did not arrive at that warning through theory. He arrived at it through grief, through the death of a woman who chose opium over a world that had no room for her, through the deaths of his wife and children. through watching the most knowledgeable empire on earth gun down unarmed civilians in a garden. His warning was not abstract. It was personal. It was soaked in blood and tears and the quiet, persistent grief of a man who painted a dead woman's eyes for 57 years. And the warning hasn't expired. It sits there, patient, like a letter you haven't opened yet, like a poem dictated on the day before an unwanted surgery, like a pair of dark eyes in a painting, watching you from across a century. The question isn't whether Tagore was right. He was right. The question is what we do about it. Whether we choose to be the kind of people who accumulate knowledge, or the kind who cultivate wisdom. Whether we build schools or factories. Whether we ask questions or demand answers. Whether we sit with uncertainty or perform certainty. Whether we create or consume. Whether we build our own Shantiniketan. Our own abode of peace, in the middle of a world that seems to have lost its way. And maybe that's the question his life leaves us with. Not whether knowledge is dangerous. We already know it is. But whether we have the courage to seek the wisdom that would make it safe. Whether we're willing to build our own abode of peace. Whether we're willing to learn not just with our minds, but with our hearts. I don't have the answer, but I think the question itself is worth carrying with you tonight. As you drift off, remember, there was a man who saw all of this coming, who tried to tell us, who spent 80 years building the antidote. His school is still standing, his songs are still sung, his poems are still read, his paintings still carry the same dark eyes. The warning is still there. And so is the cure. Sleep now, knowing that wisdom is not something you achieve. It's something you practice, every day, in the small moments, in the way you listen, in the questions you ask, in the things you choose not to say. That is the legacy of Rabindranath Tagore. Not the Nobel Prize, not the national anthems, not the paintings or the songs or the 2,000 poems. The legacy is the question he left behind. The question that hangs in the air like a note from one of his songs, unresolved, unanswered, beautiful in its incompleteness. Is knowledge enough, or do we need something more? He knew the answer. We're still learning it. Since you made it this far, I'm glad you enjoyed the episode. If you would like to continue listening to episodes with similar themes, I linked them in the description below. You will also find a playlist of our most popular videos. Sleep now, nightlings, and wake up, as always, a little stronger and a little wiser. The story is done, but yours continues.